Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Bite Size. If you're new here, I'm so glad you're with us this morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Kyler Cheatham, your host, and I am joined by my friend and colleague Andrew from Innovate Tax. And we'll be talking about some global tax solutions and just overall strategies of understanding when you are a bigger business or even an SMB going through any sort of technology innovation or strategy. You need to be considering what does your tax infrastructure looks like. And that's why we know our friends over at Innovate Tax is because they help us make sure that our clients are optimized in that situation. So just a few logistics before we get started. If you've been to Bite Size Live before, you know this mission is to make sure we provide some dialogue. There's no right way, there's no straight line, right, to achieving digital transformation success. It's more about what's best for your business. And how we do that is by having a diverse conversation. So I encourage you to pop in your questions, your insights into the comment section so that we can kind of have that discussion around what does it look like to be successful in technology. So just to test that feature, if you could pop in the chat wherever you're joining us from today, it aggregates all here so we can see them just where you're joining us. So go ahead and pop that in the chat here on the side, and we will get started by introducing our guests. So thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. I know we've
My
been
pleasure.
planning this for, I feel like, months now. So I personally have been really looking forward to this episode. I learned from so much from you just from our conversation. So I want to give you a chance to just do a little introduction for our audience to yourself and Innovate Tax, if you don't mind.
No, absolutely. And thank you for inviting me. As you know, I love talking about tax, and that normally is a conversation killer right there. So I'm really, really grateful that you've given a bit of a platform for me to talk about it. Um, my background is actually IT, so I specialize in tax technology and Innovate Tax. It's a company I founded. We're about 50 people strong. We work internationally across well over 150 countries, across all tax technology, from choosing the solution reviews, vendor selection, the tax determination compliance, setting it all up, make sure it all works, the support, everything, even the e-invoicing. And it's a great industry to be in, right? Because one, death and taxes, right? They're the two things guaranteed in life. And number two, every project is different. Every
Mhm.
company does things slightly differently, so you never get bored. And there's a lot of innovation happening, certainly with the digitalization of tax authorities. That means there's a lot going on. So innovation. As I say, we're UK based, and you can probably tell by I was going to say my accent, but I actually don't have one. We invented the language, so
Yeah, fair enough.
yeah.
Well,
But we do work. We have offices in the US, in the Middle East, and Europe, etc. So we do span the world.
absolutely. Yeah, we one of your colleagues we've met in the States, and we've, taken him under our wing to teach him, how to do things American. So we definitely understand the cultural difference. I can't remember what he was talking about, but he was talking about something that was just like so that kind of dumb American type of of thing
No,
that we do.
no, don't say that. There's no such thing. It's just other ignorant people that don't understand the American culture sometimes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very good. Well, let's talk a little bit about kind of the why behind tax technology. So, as you mentioned, when we're going through a technology strategy, the first thing we rarely think, right, is, oh, let me just consider what my tax infrastructure looks like. Why do you feel like that often gets left behind in kind of that phase zero conversation?
Yeah, I think first of all, I use a joke. If I want to be left alone at a dinner party, I just start talking about tax, right? And I think ultimately that's the underlying. People think tax is boring or complex, but it's actually far from the truth. We actually do a podcast. It's called "Tax People Are Not Boring," right? Because we're actually, if you're in tax, you have to be relatively smart, and actually it covers everything you pretty much do within your business, buying, selling, moving things around. It all impacts tax, and we
Mhm.
specialize in the indirect tax. So on that's VAT, GST, or in the US that's sales and use tax. But you also have payroll taxes, you have corporate taxes, you have
Mhm.
environmental taxes. It impacts everything you do. Um, But unfortunately, it's one of those things where a lot of people, because they think it's complex, they tend to try and avoid it, or
Hmm.
it ends up getting pushed towards the end. And your auditor or your accountant, they're quite happy to be paid extra money to process it all afterwards for you. So that's quite often why it's sort of left right towards the end. Not even discussed
And can you
because
tell us why it may or may not make sense to just take your accountant up on that? Like it seems kind of like an easy solution, right? To just let them kind of handle it, and pay them to do that. Why does it make sense to really own your tax strategies internally?
I think you can probably split that. I think if you're a smaller business, I think you probably can let your accountant do most of it. The volumes are very low, right? Because particularly in the US, the sales and use tax can get quite complex.
Hmm.
Depending on where you have that nexus, whether it's origin or destination based tax determination, there's a whole load of things which can that could be daunting. So if you don't have high volume, you can quite often let your accountant do it. But when we're talking, companies that get bigger, they're in more than one state or in more than one country, then you have a lot of complications. And if you actually look at most of the reports that you have to do for finance, most of the information that has to be on an invoice, it's all tax related.
Hmm.
And so actually it gets much, much more complex. And as a result, if you just leave it till the end, that's too
Hmm.
late. That's
Hmm.
too late because, as I say, it touches every part. So if someone doesn't set up a customer correctly, for example, doesn't put an exemption certificate in place, or they put an exemption, or say there's an exemption certificate, but they don't validate it, you then end up charging, no tax on your invoice. And then it turns out later on that actually that exemption certificate had expired and you should have charged tax. So they're the type of things where, you need to have, you can't sort of just go, oh, la, 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 claim ignorance and hope everything works out, because actually uh, we probably see pretty much every country is short of cash, right? We have this aging
Yeah.
population,
Hmm.
so therefore there's less taxpayers. There's more people, particularly in socialist countries, where
Hmm.
care is paid for. So where's that tax money going to come from? And ultimately, that's
Hmm.
going to come from finding companies or checking to make sure that they are doing what they said they're doing. So it's
Yeah.
it's something you have to pay more attention to.
Yeah. So it sounds like, you need to have that awareness. There's nothing wrong with having people that come in and support you, just like we do on the technology implementation side. But as, the financial leadership of the company, you need to be aware of what's going on so that that
Absolutely.
way, you can understand what that looks like and how, you're financially healthy. And it also sounds like when you're going through some sort of new technology strategy, whether it be kind of front end e-commerce, back end ERP, you need to consider where do taxes fit in that. So can you kind of explain to our audience, which is a lot of companies, consultants, CIOs that are looking at what is my technology stack, and their focus can be on kind of the more emerging technologies like AI and automation, and they're not kind of thinking where does tax fit in that? Can you kind of change that narrative or show us where the tax piece should fit in there? Should that be at the beginning? Should that be more of where we're doing, financial testing? What does that look like?
I think that's a really difficult question, because it isn't a case of, hey, look, this is the fix to a solution, sort of to a problem, right?
Yeah.
I think the first issue is that you need to understand. I suppose it's the art of the possible. What you can sit down with a company and then understand what they're doing, right? So the work we do with you guys, right? There's a lot of supply chain, it's manufacturing,
Mhm.
restructuring, looking at that, right? Now, how would you potentially say, well, we don't really worry about the tax because we're just trying to make sure that things get built, shipped, and then it's invoiced. But actually, if you name an item incorrectly, that could change the way the tax is treated,
Right.
even though it's not, right? And particularly things like AI, if the tax authority is using AI and they're then reading, particularly with countries that are using e-invoicing, there's so much data now available.
Mhm.
They can just run scans on that data. They can create a new algorithm and they can go through 10 years worth of data. So every record for every tax return for every taxpayer can continuously be checked to find, those issues. So if you don't get it right, at the beginning, then you're going to have problems. So on that analogy of, having an inventory item, You don't consider that at all. You have a naming convention that seems great. You end up, potentially creating problems down the line. Likewise, if you don't have the correct process for setting
Hmm.
up customers or suppliers, right? So you want to create a new customer, you want to get the order shipped out. The last thing you want to potentially do is check with tax to see if everything's validated and correct, right? But what you can do, something very simple, is just put a $1 credit limit on that customer. So all the order, everything can be built, but until tax have actually checked and lifted it, the actual invoice and the products won't get shipped. So there's lots of things that you can do to help the process, rather than just going, right, we're doing everything we want to do, and then tax have to deal with it afterwards. Because ultimately, most people, or the office, even of the office of the CFO, they would just see tax as, well, it's just a cost. It's a cost of
Hmm.
business for that department. It's something they have to do. What they don't realize is that all the things that they get wrong, it's the huge amount of cost to fix
Hmm.
it. It's the
Hmm.
tax audits, it's the potential fines, it's the crediting and reissuing of invoices, it's the annoying a customer because you have to say sorry for getting the tax wrong. Um,
Yeah.
it's so far reaching. And it actually, even down to the fact that if you are a company that, for example, does lots of different projects, the way you structure the company, if you're buying like a drum of 100 yards of cable, I have to say yards, I was going to use meters, 100 yards of cable,
We
you
don't
then
know.
have to
We can't
pay,
count that.
well, 100 lengths, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that if you're using it in, say, in a project, you have to pay the tax on that. But
Uh-huh.
then you move that to another project, whether it's a different city, county, you then have to readjust the tax and keep on doing that. Whereas if you actually structure the actual company, so you have potentially have like a buying entity, and it's not as simple as I'm going to make it sound, but if you have a
Hmm.
buying entity, that buying entity can make all of the purchases for the company. Everything's on a resale exemption certificate, so no tax is then charged until 10 yards of that cable is used in that project. Fine, there's the intercompany invoice for those 10 yards. We know exactly where it's being used, and we know the exact tax amount. So you don't even have to pay the tax up front or any of those adjustments. But who is going to be thinking of that when they're
Right.
thinking, okay, we want to buy a tool to streamline our projects process, right? They're not
Yeah.
thinking of the tax because it happens at the end.
Absolutely. And I mean, just the complexity of that answer, because it sounds like, and you're allowed to say, it depends, right? It totally depends on the business. So that's why you should pay attention to it more, because there is no standardization when it comes to, how everyone does this correctly. There's certainly compliance and regulations and a good, way to do things and a bad way to do things, but you need to consider what all of those options are for your business. So that's a great answer. I want to turn to the comments for a minute. So thank you all for these great questions that are coming in. If we don't get to all of them in this conversation, we absolutely will go back in to answer them. I can tag Andrew and the Innovate Tax team as well for more information. But these are awesome questions. So let's look at this one. What is the biggest misconception companies have about global tax compliance?
That it's global. It's
Yeah, yeah.
every country does things differently, and I think it's an interesting, I'm using the word global, right? Because I think the biggest misconception is that companies assume that you can just set up something and everything works in Australia.
Mhm,
You can to a certain extent, but you need to understand structure, standardization. But the other thing is then when people do have sort of tax state or different systems, they start to set everything up local to that
mhm.
system. So using different naming convention or different processes, and then what you end up having is a sort of a local, not a global sort of solution. Even though you're not
Yeah.
operating globally, the solution then has so many different components, so many different people. There's like 5 people, from that you go to for support, depending on which area. That
Mhm.
again is a big problem. It's you can't. You've got to look at what you're doing, and you've got to structure and standardization is key to any good tax solution. So
Yeah.
yeah, that is the biggest misconception is thinking you could just easily do it.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that you mentioned kind of the architecture of that in the support process, right? Who is in charge of that? Who do you call if there is an issue around it? If you need to add some sort of slab or anything like that when it comes to taxes. So this is another good one from Ashish. And always, if I butcher your names, I apologize. GST is a good concept, and this is a statement. So kind of turning it in to GST and looking at what are the pros and cons of this overall strategy. So when we're looking at GST, goods and services tax, right? And there's simplifications around that tax structure, but there's also complexities to it. Like you mentioned, different areas do things differently. You know better than I, but I think India has one of the most complicated um, tax structure in classification, understanding, and compliance. So that's kind of just an example of how different areas can do things. So, do you think GST is a good concept?
What so? Well, we have to say Indian GST because GST and VAT are very similar, and there's lots of
Yes.
countries that have GST. And actually, yes, I think the Indians have done a fantastic job. I think, unfortunately, they don't realise how many people are trying to cheat the system by
Mhm,
loading up on the IGST. Those that are in India will know exactly what I'm talking about. So what's really interesting here is the Indian government. They've changed things around. One of their concepts is we no longer go to you to basically check that your tax returns or GST returns are correct. If we You have to match everything to us, and if you think there's a problem, you have to come to us. So they changed the whole emphasis on, we don't have to do the chasing anymore, and that's actually really helped them because then you have to have someone that, first of all, they have to look at their data and go, okay, I can see why they've done that, and actually that value that or that transaction, I haven't properly done it. So they then have to make those adjustments first, and then when they do then go to the government, it's them having to prepare and them having to chase. So it makes it a lot easier. The other sort of big thing as well is that with VAT or GST, there is a concept of being able to recover the tax. So in the
mhm,
US, if you buy something, you pay the tax. It's an
mhm,
expense generally.
mhm,
So to get around that, if you're a business and you're buying, items that you manufacture or you're reselling them, if you pay the tax on every sort of stage, the amount of tax would just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So in the US, you then have to get exemption certificates, right? So if you're a reseller, you get a reseller exemption certificate. If you're making something, it's a manufacturer's exemption certificate, and that's a real pain, right? And it's very time consuming. Outside of the US, where you have VAT and GST, we have this concept of being able to recover tax. So what that means is if I in the UK buy an item, the VAT in the UK is 20%. I know that's high. Hungary, I think, is 27%. So we have a
mhm,
lot higher taxes. But I, as a business, can then get that. So the item is 100 plus 20 tax. I can get the 20 tax back. And I then, if I sell that item for 200, I then charge 40 tax. And so what happens is that the net amount I pay to the tax authority is 20. So
mhm,
depending on the country, you can then recover the VAT either as soon as you get the invoice. I don't even have to pay the supplier. I can get that money back. In
mhm,
countries like Mexico, you actually have to prove that the money's left your bank account, before you
mhm,
can recover that VAT. So there's different standards.
mhm,
Now, what India do, you can't recover the VAT or the GST unless it's actually been already been submitted by the supplier. So if my supplier doesn't register that transaction, there is no GST. I can't get it back. So that again ties a lot of things into the whole process where
right.
the Indian GST concept is very much geared up about to making sure that people are following things and doing things in the right way. Because if you don't, then you just simply won't get your GST back. Um, so it's a very good system in that way. But as you say, the complexities that are linked around it, or where you move away from simple transactions, it can then become a lot more problematic.
Mhm,
And there's still problems when you try and digitalize tax, particularly in a country like India.
mhm,
You have two extremes from wealth and poverty, and it's the same with technology and
mhm,
having someone that is literally on a rickshaw, sleeping on the street at night, and they have a food stall. They deal with cash, so there is no tax or automation or e-invoicing. So in that situation, you have there's like two sort of different levels on how they manage the tax, and that's where it can be a little bit more complex. But what India are doing with GST on
mhm.
the technology side, they're leading in a lot of those areas. So I do take my hat off to them.
Absolutely. And that's so interesting. I'd love to hear too from the audience if you've had experience with GST wherever you live. I know we have a lot of Canadian audience members, a lot of Australian audience members. So we'd love to hear kind of what your experience has been around that, specifically within considering that within your technology architecture. How did you ensure that you kind of were understanding what that looked like? So great questions here. I'm going to do one more. This is more of a statement, right, than a question. But John from LinkedIn said, great discussion. Tax tech often deserves a bigger seat at the table. It's time we recognize its role in driving smarter compliance and strategic decisions. Couldn't agree more. So on your core team, right, we have an implementation core team when it comes to new technology, whether it be a manufacturing execution system, an ERP system, a new AI and automation system, even bigger robotic machinery. Who should you invite to that core team internally to ensure that you have your tax strategies at the table?
Before that team even happens, the tax department should be having regular conversations. So, monthly or bi-monthly. So they would go to the business one month and the IT the second, right? So the tax need to make sure that the business understands the importance of tax, keep reminding them that they're there. Going back with any of the issues, whether it's master data or transactions, but also listening to the business, whether that's on the O2C side or the P2P side, to find out if the requirements around tax are a burden, if they're causing more work, or if they are, if people have a problem with it, so they can keep getting that feedback. Because if you're out of sight, you're out of mind, and a lot of departments will just forget about tax. And then on the IT
Mhm,
side, right? If someone's going, yeah, we're buying a new e-invoice solution or an invoice scanning solution or even a reporting solution, you're like, yeah, that's going to completely mess up the entire tax automation by doing that. That solution will not
mhm,
work with what we have now, or it's a really bad solution for
mhm,
what we need it to do. So you need to understand, and ultimately, tax should sign off any products that are linked to anything that's to do with the buying, selling, or movement of
mhm,
goods or services within the company. Tax should have an overview and say, yeah, we're okay, we've checked it, there's no issues there, go ahead and buy it, or no, this does impact tax, we need to be involved. So it starts before that team has even been created,
mhm,
that you actually have the right communication throughout the project. So when the project starts, you already have people that
mhm,
to bring in because they already understand
mhm,
the importance of the tax. Now, if you haven't done that already, and you're literally starting from square one, then you obviously need to look at the different areas, right? So depending on the type of business, right? If you're just doing services, um, that's potentially different people to also having
mhm,
manufacturing. But you need to look at the different areas where things are being bought, things are being sold, right? Obvious, but anything that's being manufactured and how those products or services are moving around. So that person can tell you, yeah, this is where we buy things. This is the process on how we buy it and how we identify what it's used for, right? Because a lot of people don't realize that
mhm,
they'll buy a product, but actually the intended use of that product, certainly in the US, can change its taxability. Um, and if they have a
mhm,
process in place already, and you then come along and say, no, it's all going to change, that's going to upset people. So you
mhm,
need to bring in people in all the different areas where the tax can be impacted, and that includes the master data. So even setting up customers and suppliers, you need to have someone that understands that area that can then convey the message to that particular team.
yeah. That, makes a lot of sense. So no matter, it sounds like, no matter who it is, right, those conversations need to be happening beforehand, not even involving technology. It does not matter if you're going through an implementation or anything. You need to make sure that there's crossover between those two teams. They really understand what that looks like as far as their
Yeah, and there's actually, if
collaboration.
I can, there's actually a question that's been asked, which I think is brilliant. I'm
Mhm.
not sure who it's from, but it says,
Oh, great.
where should tax ownership live within an enterprise? Is it time for tax to have a seat at the
Let
architecture
me
or the
see.
data governance table? And actually, it's the point. Tax should have that seat because ultimately they're involved in every part of the business. So if you want to go and find out about
Yes.
business, go and speak to the tax manager or director, because they may not be an expert, but they should have an
Mhm,
overview. But the important thing I want to talk about there is ownership. The tax team are
mhm,
legally responsible for finding data they have no control over. There is no other team or
mm,
person in a company that literally can potentially go to prison for data that they don't control in any way, right? So, and this is the one
mhm,
of the biggest challenges that tax teams have, is how do they make sure that the ownership of setting up a customer is being done right for tax, because they can't go in there and stop the issue from happening, because that's not their department. So
right.
that's the real part as
Yeah,
well, is that that communication sort of helps to make sure that people identify where the ownership is. And I think it's that tax ownership is actually breaking it down to say, okay, well, the tax department may own the tax and the reporting, but actually, who owns the master data and the importance of tax there? And actually, it
exactly.
can't be tax. It has to be the guys that are setting up. So that education, that communication has to take place, because the ownership, um, tax can't take that ownership. It they can only the saying is prevention is better than the cure. They can never prevent the issue from happening if they don't own the
Mhm,
data. So the
mhm,
next best thing is early diagnosis. And so that's what the tax team have. They have to have that ability to say, right, I can see an issue happening, and feel comfortable and confident to go to that other area, knowing that the issue is going to be resolved. Not that's it's not our problem. We don't care. We're too busy. And then you have to,
mhm.
it then starts creating problems.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important. And thank you for bringing up this question. The governance is something to consider. How is that maintained, especially when we see a new technology project? A lot of times that is preceded by master data management alignment and strategies. What does that look like as far as utilizing our AI, machine learning, automation, but also, right, where does that look like as far as making sure that our financial data is healthy, and all of that is kind of squared away? And I think that kind of goes along with another question we got on YouTube, which says, what is the opportunity in aligning tax data with broader enterprise intelligence and analytic strategies, right? So a lot of times when we think data, master data management, whether you're a process owner, a business process owner, a data steward, whatever your role is, not a lot of times are we considering tax, because it is often in the organization a siloed area that a lot of people just don't understand. So kind of bringing that out is the point of this conversation, adding that collaboration to make the business more successful just in general. So what's your thought on looking at specific financial and tax data and that alignment across just the master data management of the
Yeah, I
enterprise?
mean, that's one of my areas of speciality. I mean, we've built products around the management of master data as well, because ultimately it's the key. Everything starts with your
Mhm,
data, and actually, um, if you set up a good tax solution and with the right processes, then the rest of the business benefits. Because if you have a transaction that has to follow things in a certain way because it can impact the tax, when people start bending those rules to
mhm,
fit their narrative, that can impact the tax, but it can also impact other reporting and financial, numbers. So actually having a good tax solution or an indirect tax solution will improve everything from a business point of view. Now the one I think I've mentioned already, that tax authorities, when they're putting that data, they can literally then, if you think it's going into a data graveyard, that's not true, right? I have this slide that
mhm.
you have these data zombies, right? Call them data zombies. They come out from the ground, and we're saying any point in the future that data can rise from the dead and cause you a problem, right? So it's not just about the now; it's about the future, in terms of the master data. And the thing is, as well, then, when you've got um, good governance around tax and master data, there's a lot of, you know, whether it's an EIN, a TIN number, a VAT number, GST number, quite often these are unique identifications, right? So you can actually use that information to ensure you don't get duplicate customers or suppliers,
Mhm.
that people are entering the information in the right way, right? So that good governance around the master data that's linked to tax actually can really improve the quality of your data. And you can use tax as an excuse to say, no, we have to do this from a tax point of view. And therefore that forces the narrative to the rest of the business to say, no, we have to do this from a compliance
Mhm.
point of view, but you're actually, lifting the quality of the data for all parts of the business. But you need also, I think that
Mhm.
part of the problem is because that tax department, if they're if they are responsible for looking after the data, from a tax point of view,
Mhm.
there's it could be 3 months before they end up looking at it due to their process. And that's
Mhm.
the problem, is that they need that sort of better visibility and the ability to sort of push back to the business. So those traditional approaches of doing everything at the end of the month or the end of the quarter, from a tax point of view, you need to bring it forward to being in real time or as close to real time. And so
Mhm.
therefore you can prevent issues from getting worse. And you actually change. So you ultimately have like a tax data analyst who is making sure that all the data is working in the right
Cool.
way. Um, and then that really does then help, because you're using tax as an excuse to make sure that everything else is clean and correct, for the business. Um,
Yeah. That's excellent. Yeah, that me I think that that's so smart, and kind of building that into your observation dashboard. What are you seeing that should be, part of that business intelligence overall initiative, and considering how you cross collaborate with your colleagues to ensure we're seeing the whole lens of the business proactively,
yeah,
right? Not that we had an issue with taxes and now we're all running around crazy trying to figure it out, but we were able to kind of forward think those scenarios when we were implementing our business intelligent dashboards. So I love that approach. Another one here I think is really good. I love when the audience does my job for me over here, with all these amazing
great
questions. So
questions.
thank
Yeah.
you. Keep them coming. Yeah, absolutely. Is I think this is so interesting. How can companies build a feedback loop between tax, finance, operations to catch these problems early? Or even how have you seen this collaboration set up well? Because I think back to our practice. I don't know that I've ever seen it. We're in more complex manufacturing. So a lot of times if we have a complex tax client, we call it Andrew and his team because it's not our expertise, but internally, I'm wondering if you are, a CEO or a leader of the company, how do you make sure that these teams are talking to each other or they have that opportunity?
I think the first thing is that you need that buy-in at the C-suite. You need to have that CEO, or the CTO,
Hmm.
CEO, their buy-in, so that they are supporting the fact that you need good tax, right? I was speaking to chief economist of one of the inter-American banks, who does, works with a lot of the South American and Central American
Hmm.
countries, so much more involved with the governments there. And one of the things that he was saying was that you have tax data. So from a government level, the tax data is now almost replacing like the National Statistics Office, because the tax data is, particularly things like e-invoicing, it's instantaneous. You literally can have a finger on the pulse of a country, because those invoices, as it's
Hmm.
happening, you're getting that information back. So the information that you
Hmm.
can get from your tax data, even fed into, like, say, if I would give you the most accurate sort of information in terms of how the business is doing at that point, right? Because someone can give you a list of, this is our sales pipeline, or this is the amount of products that we're building, or even these are the sort of transactional, the revenue. But actually, if you look at the transactions and the types of taxes and everything else, you can actually see where the business is taking place. Um,
Hmm.
the other thing as well is that we've built a product that does, or creates it bridges the gap for the missing link. And
Hmm.
the way I liken it is that it's taken me like 15 years to understand this myself. But to me, there are three levels when it comes to sort of the tax management and compliance. And the first level
Hmm.
is, which most companies don't even get to, is just visibility and transparency of data. So that's the goal.
Hmm.
So many companies
Hmm.
out there that just the quality of the data they get isn't great. They have to do so many adjustments and everything else. But when you create a solution through automation and good compliance, and you have the right processes, because again, any solution will fail without the right process. But you do need a
Hmm.
solution to make sure the processes are being followed, right? But once you've got that data,
Mhm.
you start seeing all the problems. So now you need a way of being able to fix those problems. And part of the issue with that
Mhm.
then is that if you use, reporting or even tools like Alteryx, every time you run that report, you're always going to show the issues. And it could be that that particular transaction actually isn't an issue, right? So the level two is the ability to manage the data. So the tax team have to be able to say, okay, this
Mhm.
month these are all the transactions where I've got problems. I've checked all of these; they're all green.
Mhm.
These ones are red. I can focus on those, but everything else is done. I don't have to worry about those anymore. The third level,
Mhm.
we call it closing the loop. It's the monitoring part,
Mhm.
because this is so even if you've got spent money, you've got compliance, automation, everything else, the real problem then is getting the rest of the business to actually correct the data. And we talked about that earlier, right? That
Mhm.
ownership, because if someone hasn't set up a customer correctly, they haven't put in the exemption certificate, for example, they haven't classified an item, they've created a whole bunch of new items and no one's told the tax department, or they haven't put a VAT or GST registration number on. All of these components will impact the tax. And particularly now with things like e-invoicing, the tax authority, if they reject it, then you've got to reissue. You've got to, if you've sent the invoice to your customer, you've then got to call them up and say, oh, by the way, we give you the wrong one. We have to then get it back. You then have to, send a new one out. So
Mhm.
it's massive burden if you get things wrong now.
Yeah.
And so having that third level of closing loop is having a way of automatically ensuring that the rest of the business does the cleanup of the things that are causing the problems downstream. And that's something
Yeah.
we've solved now. We're
Yeah.
only recently, but we've solved that now. And it took me 15 years really to work it out, because most tax sort of departments you go into, they're still on level one. They're not even at level one. They're desperately trying to get that data.
Yeah.
So you can't go to level three. They may look at it, oh yeah, it makes sense, but they can't
Right.
relate to it, because they don't have those
Yeah.
problems. They don't have the problems of being able to sort stuff out, because their problem is that they don't even know where the issues are. So that's a
Yeah.
really hard challenge that we have. And you have to basically go in like kindergarten, middle
Yeah.
school, etc. You have to take them through the stages,
Mhm.
and ultimately, I think with every project, right? It's as my friend Jeff Peck would say, it's a journey, not a project. You can never have
Oh
a
yeah.
project and there's the go
Yeah.
live. It's like, okay, fine, we go live, but what's next? We have to keep on refining it.
What? Yeah. What now? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, first of all, that sounds like an excellent innovation, to, for businesses to take advantage of. Because I think a lot of times that's where silos come from, is misunderstanding, right? That's why a lot of times we don't want to talk to the tax team because we don't know what they're talking about, right? We don't know, they're speaking a different language than we are in the business or in IT. And that's where those silos come from, is just a level of misunderstanding. So being able to solve those issues, and we see that a lot in technology implementation failures, is because nobody said anything, or right, they said something and it didn't get through the tiers to who it needed to get through, because we didn't have that ability to cross collaborate. We had no idea there was a huge issue in the tax department because we weren't having those collaborative
Yeah,
conversations. So I think there's a lot that comes into this. If you're going to invest multi millions of dollars into new software, you need to make sure that your teams are structured so that they have the ability to see the ROI on that investment.
absolutely.
So that's such good information. Um, let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to get to some more of these questions here in a minute, but let's talk a little bit about tax technology and some of the innovations that you're seeing in the marketplace. I think personally, a lot of times when we talk about AI and what's kind of going on as far as enterprise tech, I think of areas that other people don't often think of. We're not talking about like kind of robots zooming around the shop floor, right? We're talking about things like being able to fill in those data gaps that we see in those areas for master data management governance structure, so that we can have that clean historical data to make good business decisions by utilizing things like AI. And that's just an example of ways that it's usefully helping companies right now. What are some things that you're seeing kind of in the tax world that are some really cool innovations in the last, year or so, or that you see coming in the future?
I think AI is a great sort of subject to talk about, particularly in tax. And I think tax is rules based. You don't really need AI to determine the tax. Where so if someone says, "Oh, we're going to use AI, it's going to work out what the tax is," like, yeah, well then that's you don't need that, because if the data is in the right place, then the rules will work it out anyway. So therefore, the AI isn't having to make
Mhm.
stuff up. But the AI is great for looking for the gaps or for classifying. So if you're in the
Mhm.
US, there's a lot of mapping of whether it's HSN or USPS codes and things like that to products based on descriptions.
Mhm.
So that's where the AI would be great. And AI also, there's lots of different levels. If you look at machine learning, for example, checking for for patterns and seeing where those problems are, and actually
Mhm.
bringing in information. So one of the tax authorities, they use graph theory, and what they do, they bring data in. So this is Taiwan. They have a special sort of ministry that manages all the data. So rather than having each individual ministries like finance or people, whatever else, having their own data teams, they
Mhm.
combine them all. So they actually then it's the same team, and they go, right, oh well, we can use this data from this area. And so the example I give is that if you have if you take the data from like cash-based businesses on a high street or on a strip
Mhm.
mall or whatever else, and you then
Mhm.
cross-reference that with footfall traffic of the same location. If you then have
Mhm.
high revenue and low footfall, it's probably money laundering, right? But if you have the other way around, high footfall and low revenue, well, someone's probably doing a lot of cash deals, right? So it's things like that
Mhm.
from if you've got good quality data and you start combining it with different areas,
Mhm.
you can actually then really get into start finding some patterns.
Mhm.
And it's not just a case of going, right, this company here, they're we're
Yeah,
going to do them for money laundering, because they could just be a successful business.
exactly.
But
Yeah,
that opens it up to then say, right,
exactly.
what else can we do to analyze that data? And I think that's the key with AI, is that you
Yeah.
use AI to help, but it basically speeds everything else up. And actually, with because you keep on mentioning like data, blah, blah, and that is so important, because AI only
Mhm.
works if you've got good quality data. And that's one of the other
Yeah,
reasons that if you
absolutely.
have a good tax solution, it enforces all the transactions to be done in the same way. So if you stop someone making
Mhm.
adjustments via journal entry, well, if you do that, that potentially means that your AI doesn't pick up on that data because it's been done in a different way, right?
Mhm.
Or you could do it so that the AI does
Mhm.
pick up on that because it's coming through a different method. But the
Mhm.
point is that
Mhm.
regardless of whether you use AI or traditional reporting, if you have a well structured solution and you can ensure that everything has been done in the correct way, then you can also ensure that the quality of the data is at the highest level that it can be. And that's really what I think it comes down to, is that it's almost like there's no point using AI to use the data if the data is bad. You first of all should use the AI to clean up the data, and we've been doing that as well with
Yeah.
what we do. But even down to machine learning and looking at the different patterns, you can put a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
So, for example, in the US, if you've got a supplier and you've got 10 transactions, and 9 of those transactions are exempt, but one of the transactions was recorded as use tax, right? May not be any problems,
Mhm.
but that's the type of thing you can quite easily flag because it falls outside of a pattern. Someone can
Mhm.
check and go, yeah, that they should have used exempts. Why they use tax, and that can then
Mhm.
save the company money, or from a compliance point of view. So there's little things like that. You don't have to think massive or big. You can actually focus the AI, machine learning, or other sort of processes in specific areas to help clean up that data and ensure it's
Mhm.
compliant.
And I would argue that kind of iterative implementation of AI is a great way to learn and scale, right? Too, in being able to look at an area of the business, find a use case for that, and then move to the next area of the business. Because many times, a lot of people we talk to, right, will come to the table and be like, hey, our strategy for 2025 is AI. And you're always like, and what? Right? And right, and you're like, "That's a sentence, right? That's
That's the
not
same
so much
team
of a
whose strategy
strategy."
was blockchain,
Yeah.
5 years ago, right?
Right. Exactly, and I don't I'm not at all saying we shouldn't be bold thinkers. We shouldn't be, striving for innovation. But we also have to give our teams direction, and we have to see successes from these types of different things. So starting with utilizing AI to look at your data, your historical data, start to fill in those. We just have to watch out for that false confidence, right? Where we're teaching the tool, to Andrew's example, right? Where the tool needs to be learning as well as that journal entry when it's changing, right? So those types of different things are important to consider. But I think that's super cool to kind of see how data is truly the basis for everything, even in tax. And so if you were advising a company right now on some tax solutions to look at. Say they have, heavy tax requirements. There's a lots of needs there. I know it's difficult to kind of just, pick out solutions that would match a business. But what are some kind of star players you're seeing out there in the marketplace
Oh,
around
that's
tax?
that's a difficult. I wouldn't even like to necessarily say there are any really that I know. I think
Yeah.
you've got a lot of the well-established companies who offer great products, services. They tend to have a higher price tag, and then sometimes you look under the hood, right, and you find that it's there's a lot of APIs holding everything together. So they may not
Yeah.
necessarily be they've grown through acquisition and they've got a good sales and marketing, but
Hmm.
maybe underneath it. You've then got a lot of startups that say, yeah, we can do this, we do that. But then when you really
Hmm.
look at it, you're like, yeah, but that's only going to work for that mum and pop style of business. It's not scalable because actually
Yeah.
you're not taking into consideration this, and this. Um, there's a couple of, there are a couple of companies who have the right attitude. I'm not going to name any names, just because those that I do or those that I don't, that could put me in a bit of trouble. But I think what you want to do, and we've done this with a client before, is they didn't actually have the budget for tax transformation, and they used the process
Hmm.
of doing vendor selection to actually understand what their business model case and everything was. By actually doing that and actually
Hmm.
getting those companies to showcase what they could do, um, they then learned a lot about what they could do. Any of the misconceptions they had, or it gave them new ideas. And then from that, they were able to then sort of put all of their business case together and the pricing to then go to the C-suite to say, look, this is the justification and the money that we need. So I'm not necessarily saying you go to 10 different vendors and bring it all in, but what I would say is that
Yeah.
there's been so many new companies been created recently because of the tax tech or the e-invoicing. And what I say,
Hmm.
I say the majority of those are just trying to build something using existing technology. There isn't the innovation. You don't see it.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, a lot of that is down to you've got to make money first, right? So if a client is asking for
Hmm.
that, it doesn't matter if that's the right thing or not. That's what the client's asking for. So we'll build
Hmm.
for them rather than saying, well, I know the client's asking for that, but that's because of the problem with X, Y, and
Hmm.
Z. If we create this solution, it gets rid of the X, Y, and Z problem and they can do so much more. But you build that tool, certainly in the tax world, people are still going to be buying the one that fixes it, does the other fix because that's all they know. And so that's part of the
Hmm.
issue I see, is that there's a lot of companies that are trying to make and be innovative, but there's also a lot who have a lot of money behind them that are literally just recreating the same things, or it's all like Excel based stuff. You're like, come on guys, we're trying to move away from this, and you're just feeding the
Yeah.
fire. It's like
Yeah.
the tax authorities also, I think, have a lot to answer for. I think the tax authorities have a brilliant opportunity to really help the taxpayer,
Mm.
but instead,
Yeah.
a lot of
It's
the
so true.
e-invoicing, right? It's
Yeah.
just it's like you just send us the e-invoice. You can send it to the customer at the same time, and they're just it's like no, you should be checking it, right? To the point, I've just written an article actually
Yeah.
where imagine a situation where instead of charging actual tax, you just charge the tax code. So in that situation, you upload your invoice. It has the $100 plus the tax code that indicates that it should be 10%. The tax authority can then
Hmm.
add that 10% on based on the code, so they can check it. They add the 10% on. The
Hmm.
customer then downloads it. So now you've got a single point to download. No more AP entry or anything else. Everything comes through a channel that has already been approved by the government, so everything's already linked in. And then the supplier can be paid the $100, so they don't have to worry about any of the tax, any of the filing, anything else.
Hmm.
And then the customer pays the tax authority the $10 for the tax. But if you've got GST or VAT, you can then offset it, right? So that type of thing,
Hmm.
you're now creating a process where a company can say, we do not accept any invoices unless they go through the portal. And then we just download one thing and we know that everything we get is already within the authorities. There's not going to be any reconciliation issues or anything else. There are some countries doing things along those lines. India, for example, is doing that type of stuff.
Hmm.
And there may be some teething issues and complexities. but it really does
Yeah.
prevent a lot of the tax fraud. And the interesting thing as well is that the tax authorities really want to help companies. So if people make mistakes, they have a lot of processes. They call it nudging and stuff. Say, look, are you sure that you've done this right? They're not out there just to go and fine and be a pain.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a lot of companies out there that will commit fraud, and the burden of that fraud then impacts everybody else, right? So if you create those
Yeah.
solutions, it may be a little bit more of a pain, but if you can reward that with easier submissions or returns or even less, tax, then that's going to be a
Hmm.
much better sort of process. But as I say, so many tax authorities, they don't take it to the next level. They just do the bare minimum. A lot of it is there's other legislation or privacy laws, or it's just they just don't want the
Yeah.
hassle because it will create more work. And I think that's a shame. But like I say, there's when you're going shopping, look in more than one window.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just the breadth of that answer showcases the need for you to go in there and understand your unique requirements, right? Not the new startup vendors that, are kind of flying all of these different things. When you talk to them, innovation is cool, but have you implemented this before? How successful has it been? Right? You never want to kind of really be the first to go through those types of implementations because
Unless you
it
get
just
a
can
very
be a
big
huge risk
discount.
to the business. Yeah,
Yeah,
even that, sometimes you
that's
get what
true.
you pay for. Yeah, yeah, but, again, that could be the answer for you, right? Is to utilize a company like that. Just be sure you understand your requirements. And I think that's a good, this is, more of a statement, but I think this is a good kind of ender to our conversation, concluding question of everyone wants to be on the newest trend before understanding how it will truly work within your business. What are the steps people can take directly after this conversation to better understand how their tax processes and people and strategies work before even considering any new
Well,
initiatives?
again, that's a really difficult question because what I'd say is, that information should be on your company portal somewhere, but it just isn't. Again, that's something we've created
Mhm,
is an AI tool that builds up based on client specific information so that you can use that chatbot to ask a
mhm,
question, and it's not just going onto the internet, it's actually using the
mhm,
data that your tax department have actually used.
mhm,
I think if you're an individual, so depending on what part of the business you're in, so not a tax person, I think the first thing to do is set a meeting up with your tax manager. Because they could be. I have there's two types, right? Of well, maybe there's three types. There's a tax sort of manager or director who really understands what is possible. They're very trying to be proactive, even if they're being held back. They want to make change. That they know they can make change.
mhm,
You then have the sort of tax manager who is in a similar situation, but they're just so busy they can't get out that rut. And then the third one is
mhm,
is the one that's retiring and doesn't want any change, and they just want to do the same manual processes because they can go home at 5 o'clock. Um, so if you go and speak to the tax department, if you get number three, you're probably gonna, you may then have to go onto the internet. But if you get one or two, I'm pretty sure that they'll be more than happy to go, look, this is where we need help, or this is what, in your
yeah.
area, this is what you guys do good or do badly, and this is the reasons why we need to do things in this particular way. And I think that's something which,
Mhm,
if you're going to do, go and speak to your tax manager department. But otherwise, if you're interested in the tax side of things, plenty of content. This webinar, for example, there's plenty of content out there.
yeah.
As I said, we do a podcast, Tax People Not Boring. So sign up to those types of podcasts and things, and just listen. Even if it's drive to work,
Mhm,
and there may be something there. And it may not even be that you care so much about tax, but you go, oh, I can actually use that in my area. But the more you understand about the
yeah.
tax and the complexities and actually
Mhm,
the burden on a company to make sure that they meet the tax requirements, the more sympathetic you're going to be for that next project, or when someone does come asking for help, you can say, yeah, okay, what can I do to help you guys? Um, but just have an
mhm,
open mind, right? Don't be shut off. And I suppose the most important thing is understand that the impact on tax can have a massive impact on the company. So don't just ignore if you see
mhm,
something that's linked to tax and you can just go, oh, just put this through as exempt. Don't. Make sure you flag it, and it's followed up.
yeah. Absolutely. Well, this has been such an awesome conversation. I know I've personally learned so much from you and our audience. So, thank you so much to the audience for all of these amazing questions. As I said, I'll always go back in and answer each one of these questions. You always have that commitment from me. This is a team effort. Certainly, I'm just the catalyst and the mouthpiece over here to all of your great ideas. So, we so appreciate your time today, Andrew. If people want to get in touch with you or follow your content or see some of the Innovate Tax technology in action, how can
Yeah,
they
I
reach
think,
out?
LinkedIn is an obvious one, right? My name's quite unique,
Mhm,
but Andrew Bohnet, just search for me on LinkedIn. Go via, um, your website, right? There'll be links on there. We can put the information up. So, but I'm
mhm.
always happy. I love talking tax. I bore the hell out a lot of people. So when I have a captive audience, it's my element. But I'm always happy to discuss the impacts tax, future tax, and if you've got any issues or problems, how you can solve those. So that's absolutely fine doing that. So just I think potentially just reach out on LinkedIn, and then I'll be do a personal message, for example, and I'll then happily get back to you.
Excellent. Well, that's amazing. I highly recommend following Andrew. That's how I met him, was by following his content on LinkedIn because he's so approachable when it comes to talking about information. I'm not a finance person. When we do technology, we have, finance consultants, but we don't have people that, that are really in the depths of tax, which is why I reached out to Andrew because that was a gap for us and our customers. So I highly recommend, following him and the Innovate Tax team. They put out a lot of great content. For Bite Size, you can subscribe wherever you're joining us from today. I have a newsletter on LinkedIn that will come out next week with a summary of this conversation. We have a podcast and a YouTube channel. It really helps our message when you're able to subscribe and support kind of the amplification of this transparency and just the exchange of ideas. So I deeply appreciate that. We are live usually on Tuesdays, but every week on LinkedIn. Again, if you follow us, then you're able to see when we'll be live and what we'll be talking about next. Next week, we actually have a professor that I lecture with to talk about the use of internships, how to get the most out of that, and how to build a pipeline around younger employees, something I know that the Innovate Tax team is very good at too, making tax seem cool. So, um, with that, we'll say goodbye for today, but big thank you to you, Andrew. We so
Pleasure.
appreciate your time, and we will see everyone
Great.
next
No,
week.
absolutely.